Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar Wednesday. This week's topic, first steps to understanding test automation, with me, your expert, Benjamin. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask at any point, put them in the chat. I'll be seeing them and I'll be happy to inform and potentially answer any questions that you may have. So without further ado, let's get into today's webinar. First though, I wanted to have a quick discussion about the history of test automation, just so we sort of know where it's come from and where we think it may be going to. After that, I want to take a look at why we should even be looking at test automation in general, as well as talking a little bit about the ISTQB Certified Tester Test Automation Engineer certification, which is the main certification that test automations engineers should get, I'd say. Followed by a quick look at automated versus manual testing, sort of pros and cons of each, because they are both very important in terms of testing, but they do have some slight differences in strengths between them. And finally, a bit of a recap from Daniel's webinar not too long ago, looking at what kind of automated testing tools exist right now and what you can use in your work. So, firstly though, let's have a quick history of test automation. Well, as we possibly know, we had the first ever software in 1948. Before that, we were looking at, I guess you could call computers. We were looking at Turing machines, we were looking at complex switches and levers, complex machines, but we never really got to computers as we could sort of think about them today until 1948, when we were looking at the Manchester Baby computer. And it had a very difficult task, first of all, and that was the first piece of software that was made, was to calculate the highest factor of 2 to the power of 18. Nowadays, incredibly easy, simplistic task, but back in the day, quite complex, and it already proved the power of software as we know it. But what about testing? Well, testing didn't come until 1958. So, of course, still given some time for computers to sort of develop and progress. But now, by 1958, we're seeing computers take on a more important role in various different fields, and we're realizing that, hey, actually, having testers ensures that the software sort of starts to work more accurately to the way we actually want. And so this is when software testing takes its first grand strand into the professional realm, and we get our first manual testing team. Then, in the 1970s, we have a great development. We have TATE, or the Automated Testing Environment, by Hewlett-Packard, or HP. This testing environment used scripts that we still use nowadays to automate tests, and was primarily used for functional testing that was then later brought in and properly, I'd say, developed in 1978. Before this, we were still doing functional sort of tests, of course, but this is when functional testing really took a foothold and sort of developed as a medium. Normally, at this point, we looked at finite state machines, or looking at black box approaches, or digital system testings. So this is when we really start to get into what makes software testers and what they do. But following that, though, we actually get some recognition about software testers with the first version of the IEEE 829 standard for software test documentation. At this point, the IEEE, as we hopefully all know, is the international standard for electrical engineers and electrical engineering, which includes a lot of people in IT and software tester roles. And so here we have software testers as an actual part of the process and system, which is fantastic. What a fantastic and great win for us. Sorry, just had to check a fin. Okay. So that's what we want, but we still haven't covered automation testing yet, because we get to our first automation testing tool with WinRunner in 1991. Not too much information has survived Windrunner in 1991, I will say, from 1991. But it does stand as one of the legacy first test automation tools, which is, of course, fantastic. And then in 2001, we see a big development in terms of how we think about software development in general with the Agile Manifesto. So Agile was already a concept, of course, in the early 1990s, but it was more so conceptual ideas of what would become Agile. And we're sort of moving away from our structured, rigid software development life cycles into more free-flowing ones with Agile, and this sort of helps us focus more on the tests that we can do. And following the period of 2002 to 2005 with Jira, Selenium, SOAP UI, we get into automated tests even further. As well, here we have the ISTQB, the International Software Testing Qualification Board. So we really see where automated testing has come up. Jira was originally a issue tracker, but it now has capabilities for test automation. Selenium already started out as a test automation tool, as well as did SOAP UI, which I talked about briefly last week with our API webinar. So we have a bunch of developments from 2002 to 2005 that really come into test automation and testing in general, and we never really stopped because we've been going on since then. But if we're looking at big milestone achievements, then I'd say definitely the one we need to keep an eye on is 2021, which we had the start of AI-assisted testing. Not only testing with AI, so using AI to sort of testing AI in general, so using code that was written by AI and testing that, which is very much now a thing, but also using AI to assist us in focusing on where we should be testing and where we can. So not just looking at large language models, although that is a big source of investigation right now, but also looking at neural networks and other types of AI too. So covered a bit of history, a quick crash course, if you will. But actually, what is test automation? And I want to really highlight the Certified Tester Test Automation Engineer certification from the ISTQB. Some of the information from this webinar will be pulled from that certification, and it is truly a certification that all test automation engineers should seek to achieve, as it helps highlight your knowledge of test automation in general. But what is test automation? Well, simply put, by the ISTQB, it is using software tools to control and set up test execution. With this, I think the two most important words we have are control and setup. Control, meaning not only does it execute it itself, so we execute tests in an automated way, but also that we control and we check and compare the actual results to our expected results that we achieve. Setup also means that our test automation tools should set up their own environment in which they need to be running in, or at least can set up an environment or have access to an environment in which they can set up and run. And the test automation tools should go from beginning to end seamlessly by themselves, ideally, of course. Maybe some tests that do require some human intervention, and that's okay too, that can still be part of test automation. But generally speaking, we want test automation tools to go from setting up the environment, running the tests, closing down the environment at the very end, and of course, reporting back on what happened. What are some advantages of test automation though? Well, I'd say the simplest advantage of test automation is the most obvious one, and that is it's just automated. Of course, as I just said, doesn't necessarily need to be 100% automated, but generally speaking, the goal is full automation can carry through all of its scripts, all of its tests from beginning to end, and this means that we don't need manual testers. Although manual testers do play a very important role in software testing, and as we'll see, manual testers can and do some roles which test automation cannot. But I mean, in terms of just pure what test automation can do, it does remove a need for manual testers in that area. Test automations can also be used to set up and run automatically at certain intervals, which is fantastic, as we'll sort of get into when we think about when our automated tests can actually be run. Test automation also gives us a good deal of consistency between each run, especially if we're comparing it to that sort of human element. Now, I do have a asterisk here, as there's not going to be 100% consistency. We're still going to get some weird race conditions or other errors that are out of our control. But we're going to have a great deal more consistency than just having regular manual testers perform the same sort of tasks. And a nice other advantage is that automated tests are executed faster than manual. I did have someone ask me about this when I showed them this webinar Wednesday earlier, and what do I mean by faster? Well, it's true. Automated tests do take longer to set up and perform the first time compared to manual, but repeatedly running those automated tests is going to be a whole lot faster than manual testing. And we'll sort of cover that more as well when we compare the two. But when do we actually perform test automation? When can we perform these automated tests of ours? Well, it depends on which sort of model we're looking at. If we're looking at the waterfall model, then sadly we can only really perform test automation during the verification phase. This is simply because in the previous phase of the waterfall, we have the actual build phase, where we construct the code, and we can test code at that point, but it is a bit more difficult to, especially if the code is rapidly being changed and updated. So we normally really do it only at the very end with verification phase. Compare this to normal software testing, which may not even look at the code base and doesn't look at the code at all, in which we can always test too. So keep that in mind. We, of course, need, if we're doing automated testing, we need the software to test it with. If we're looking at a V model, then we can actually test in each distinct separate layer of the V model near the end after development has started. Once again, we can always test during the V model, no matter what sort of section stage we're at. But with software, we need to look at the component testing or integration testing, then move on to the system and system integration, and finally the acceptance when we look at all those different layers from the V model together. And then we have Agile. And Agile, with their quick iterations, working normally on an iterative process, where every sprint you will add a little bit more to it. The key thing with Agile is that test automation can happen all the time, normally with DevOps. A lot of the time with Agile is that you're going to be adding to a repository, and then Agile will do regular, maybe even nightly runs of its testing suite. If there are any issues, they will be flagged, so we can get some quick feedback and iterations going. Very important for Agile to at least try and use test automation, as that keeps it moving fresh, keeps it moving fast, and you build up a really big backlog of tests too. Tests that you can, of course, trim down as you need to, but tests that ensure everything is backwards compatible. New features don't break previously old tests, which is very important, as you don't want to upset your clients and break a previously completed feature. So I discussed when test automation can be performed, but where can test automation be performed? Where does it take place? Well, the cool thing with test automation is that it works in all kinds of environments, and we are free to use different kinds of test automation in different stages. If we're looking at just a local development environment, then this means we're normally looking at test automation in terms of component testing or GUI testing or API testing even. And we normally also use IDEs with even some white box testing tools. Yes, even your IDE, when it tells you that you've misspelled your function, that is a form of test automation. Then we get into the build environments. Here, we can also look at components testing, as well as component integration, and more static analysis tools. These are all test automated tools that are run automatically, that we don't need to interrupt and interfere with ourselves. Although, of course, we still can perform manual testing. Then we have the system integration phase, the integration, in which, of course, we can perform system integration tests. This also includes UI or API tests. And normally in this phase, we also look at monitoring the system under test, just to make sure that it is performing as we expect. Not just that it's performing the right task, but it's performing within the limitations, the confines, the expectations of the system itself. We're not maxing out the CPU on some basic request, is what I mean. Then we can move on to pre-production. Here we have some non-functional quality characteristics that are normally examined, as well as looking at user acceptance tests to ensure that it fits the user's needs and fits our non-quality needs too. And finally, we move on to production, or our operational environment, in which we can run all kinds of automated tests in our production environment. But the key ones I'd say for this area are normally looking at canary releases, in which we just release a new feature to a part of a user subset, or A/B testing, in which we'll make a small change to the system overall and send it normally about 50-50, although percentages and divisions can change, to our users. So one group of users will experience the slight change, the other will have a standard system or maybe a different change in opposite direction, and you sort of see what works best. And this is all from test automation. We all can see what test automation can bring us. And so I want to move on now to looking at automated versus manual testing. And with that, also have a quick refresher on manual testing itself. Manual testing, as the name might imply, requires testers to manually perform the test steps. Manual testing can work on all kinds of software, as opposed to test automation, which does require software that provides some level of feedback or can be interacted with in a more code way in a lot of cases. And manual testing, as we're not computers, we don't require specific steps in order to test the software. Now, this isn't always true, of course. I'm more so talking about exploratory testing, which I will cover in next week's webinar. But good manual tests also do still have a script that needs to be followed for how testing should be performed. There are on occasions, of course, tests that should be performed sort of freehand by exploring the software. And that is an option, but that is definitely not an option in automated tests. So as for actually looking at automated versus manual testing, let's first look at how we run the two different kinds of tests. Well, in automated testing, as the name implies, the software performs these kinds of steps. We normally use a testing framework of some kind that is a automation tester to run the software ourselves, compared to manual testing, in which, well, we actually have people. Then, how are the tests actually performed? Well, for automation testing, we normally break these test steps into specific steps or statements that need to be taken one by one, and they need to be performed each time that the test is run. In manual testing, we can sort of still have our checklist testing of what steps need to be performed, but we can also have sort of general test steps that may not always be consistent, but maybe inconsistency is something that you actually want. So what happens if the software is actually changed? Well, if we're looking at automated testing, if the software is changed in a drastic way, it may mean that we need to actually update our test scripts in order to ensure that the automated tests don't break. Depending on how you're writing your automated tests, you may look at a page model system in which you need to update just one section of your test to ensure that it doesn't break. Or if you're not using a page model system, you may need to update quite a few areas of your automated tests, especially if you're changing functions or like. But if we're looking at manual tests, then we may need to update some steps and their requirements, but also manual testers may be able to work around these software changes in general. They should probably report and make sure that these changes are well known, but they can work around these. So when can we run tests? Well, automated tests can run literally any time we want. The whole idea of nightly runs is we're testing the software during the middle of the night when people are less likely to be using it, so we can go all out of our tests. We can test from 1 a.m. to like 5 a.m. and then we have our full completed list of tests that we can then check the following morning to see if any have failed, and if so, let's investigate them further. Manual tests, of course, do need to be run manually by testers. So, unless you want to hire your manual testers to test your piece of software at 1 in the morning, you're probably not going to get that overnight testing experience. But, once again, you can always combine the tests together, or you can always combine both methods together, I should say. Manual testers do have a place in the testing ecosystem, definitely. But, remember automated tests. And what about some limitations with our testing? Well, the limitation is quite large for automated testing because we can only run software which allows for automation. If our software can't be automated in some way, then it's not really automation friendly and we can't actually run it. So, well, it's a dead end there. But with manual testing, we can do it on all pieces of software. Because if we can't test it manually, then how are our clients supposed to use it? How is it supposed to be used otherwise? Maybe there's a highly technical system in which it's probably better to automate it rather than manual, but I'd say in the vast majority of cases, you probably find that manual testers can test a lot more software than our automated tests. But it can be harder to measure the performance on the system or of the system itself if we're looking at manual testing. Automated testing frameworks often have tools to monitor the performance of the system, so we can always see how it's going and how it's handling things. Then, a key issue that we always find, price. I'm going to bring this up after we finish going through this graph, but generally speaking, I'd say that automated testing starts out kind of expensive, but then sort of mellows out and doesn't get too much more expensive over time. Meanwhile, as we compile more and more tests, sort of not as much needs to be done in the future. Meanwhile, for manual testing, you're going to compile more and more tests, but you're going to either need more manual testers or your manual testers to work more, so it's going to cost you more then. So it's a bit of a trade-off there. We'll sort of see and visualize what I mean in a second. And finally, looking at speed and processing. So automated tests, they are, as the name might imply, incredibly fast, and you can process multiple tests at the same time. Meanwhile, manual testers, they're admittedly human, so they are kind of slow compared to automation, and normally we can only perform one task at a time. Maybe that's an issue, maybe that isn't, I'm not too sure. But to dive further into what I mean by the pricing aspect, let's have a look at an example scenario about a fictitious company. This company is looking to examine if it's worth for them to invest in automated testing. Because as they start, and as they think about manual testing, which they've always done, they know that manual testing over time is pretty linear. Let me just sort of highlight it. So we know that, yeah, there we go. So we know that as we just bring on manual testers, over time the cost will rise. We'll need to bring in more manual testers, they'll need to do more tests, work more, and of course that rises in cost. But if we look at automated testing, we'll have quite a high sort of barrier of entry. But once we do enter with automated testing, we see it's actually going to be a lot less steep, a lot more smooth of a line compared to manual testing. And for this company, we have the magic point right here, where these two lines intersect. What we want to say at this point is that the longer a project goes on, the more automated testing becomes worth it because it saves you far more in the long run. If you're only looking at a small and short project, then yeah, probably look at manual testing and probably prioritize that. But if we're starting to look at really large and complex projects that are going to take quite a bit of time, then that's when automated testing really takes off and really betters the whole process. So I know we're running out of time, but that's okay because we're just about to finish up. So what automated testing tools actually exist? Well, it depends on what we're really testing. And I'm going to summarize a bit of Daniel's talk from earlier last month about becoming a test automation engineer. Because if we're talking about UI or web testing, then we're probably talking about Selenium or Cypress or Playwright. These are the sort of common ones, especially for web testing, that we can use. If we're looking at mobile testing, then we probably want to talk about Appium. Or if we're talking about APIs, then, well, as you might remember from my talk last week, we're looking at sort of Postman or Bruno. But moving on from that, we also have different types of testing that we can do. If we're looking at behavior-driven development and how we test that, then we're looking at Cucumber or Behave, depending on what language the underlying system is. If we're looking at performance testing, then we probably want to look at Apache JMeter or Load Runner as well, so we can get a really in-depth idea on how the system is performing. And of course, then we can also look at some native applications for native Windows or Mac. And how do we test those? Well, currently they're a bit harder to find, but we have Auto IT and Ranorex that are natively doing these applications. This is sort of a development and area I think test automation is definitely going to explore more and further, so we can automate all kinds of applications. And then where do we go from here? Well, if you want to start testing yourself, I'd say the easiest way is go back to the previous slides, go back 15, 20 seconds, and just pick a tool and go for it. Start learning about that tool, make some basic tests, and start moving on from there. And I'd say that there's always plenty of parts to these tools that can be a little overwhelming at the very beginning, but always strive to learn more. Always, in your next project, learn a little bit more about your tool. And when you think that you're ready, then why not go ahead and look at the ISTQB Test Automation Engineer qualification so you can become properly certified and become a test automation engineer. And that covers today's Webinar Wednesday. So, if there are any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But in the meantime, if you enjoyed today's Webinar Wednesday and you are not already following us on LinkedIn, then why not go ahead and give us a follow? We really do appreciate it. It's only a small little gesture by you, but it means so much to us. Plus, follow us on LinkedIn and give me a quick second. And you can already see our next webinar is coming up, is already live. So why not go ahead and sign up for the next webinar if you enjoyed this one. Then, if you want to know more about us and see what we're up to, then why not go ahead and check out our shop to see how you can become certified, a Robot Framework certified professional. Robot Framework is an excellent test automation tool that we really do believe in here. So if you're curious on how you can become a certified professional, why not go ahead, jump over to our shop, and would love to guide you through and help you become the very best that you can. And plus, if you want to stay up to date with us, why not go ahead and sign up for our monthly newsletter, Grow Bigger. We promise we only send you an email once a month to keep you up to date with not only our upcoming webinars, but what's happening in the world of testing in terms of developments or conferences. So would love to see you there too. So before we sign off, I do see a question in the chat. I didn't miss it. Is a mix of test automation tools okay, or should you stick to one? That's a very good question. I will say that... let me just think about it for a sec. It is a good question. It depends on sort of how much you're going into it and how much you're willing to diversify. So if I go back and say look at this, where we had our, in the previous slide, we had sort of our different web UI tests, API tests, or app tests, testing frameworks. I'd say those can combine really well with some performance testing measures as well. But you don't want to overload, because then you're not having an accurate testing experience. And I don't recommend looking at like Auto IT and Rhinorex in the same sort of testing environment. All you're doing is you're splitting your knowledge and splitting your tests between two different tools. If something was to happen to one of those tools, say that Rhinorex changed their licensing and you had to drop it, then it's a whole different pickup. Well, you have to convert over to Auto IT. That may actually be a good thing, depending if you already have some experience. And so I'd say be experienced and be knowledgeable about multiple testing frameworks and tools. But generally, I'd say if you need to perform performance testing, then pick one of these. If you need to perform behavior-driven development testing, pick one of these. Try not to sort of mix around in the same bucket of what you need the testing tool for. Keep to a specific tool as much as you can, but when it's extended past where it's sort of applicable, that's definitely when you can look at multiple different test automation tools. I hope that answers your question. And I'm just gonna wait for some sort of confirmation, just in case. All good, happy to inform. So with that said, we're a little bit over time. I do apologize, but that has been a sort of little introduction to test automation. I hope you have enjoyed as well. Make sure you check out our LinkedIn to see the next event looking at communicating testing results to stakeholders and shareholders. It's going to be really interesting, and I hope you're looking forward to it. I hope you've enjoyed the new time of 2 p.m. Central European Standard Time, Daylight Savings Time. And we're looking forward to seeing you next week for Webinar Wednesdays. Until then, this is Ben, signing off.